Sweet. Now let's do a little bit more of some code reading. Trey, could you kick us off? Could you do lines 3 through 5? Let me know if you would like any demos or examples.
All right, on line 3, we have an opening head tag.
Mhm.
On line 4, we have the opening title tag with the title HTML block and inline with closing title tag. And on line 5, we have the closing head tag.
Perfect. Thank you, Trey. Rukaya, could you do 6 through 8?
On line 6, we have the opening body tag. On line 7, we have the opening body tag with some text and an entity. And we have the closing heading tag. Did I say heading tag? H1 tag?
Yeah, you could say heading tag. I would specifically say either H1 or heading 1, because there is a actual header tag. So just for clarity, so I would say H1 or a heading 1.
Okay. On line 8, we have the H2 tag with some text and a closing H2 tag.
Perfect. Thank you. Caroline, could you do 9 and 10, please?
Okay, on line 9, there's an opening P tag. There's an opening S tag and some text, and then a closing S tag, and then there's some text and a closing P tag.
Mhm.
And then on line 10, there's an opening P tag, some text, and then a closing P tag. Oh, oops, some text and an opening EM tag, some text and closing EM tag, and then some text and closing P tag.
Perfect. And then Noah, lines 11 and 12, please.
On line 11, the opening paragraph tag. With some string, and then an inline and inline strong tag with another string block, and also another block like in the same line.
So text content.
Text content, and then closing inline tag, and a closing paragraph tag. Line 12 there. Line 12, an opening paragraph tag with some string, and closing paragraph tag.
Perfect. Take a look at the quiz questions. Trey, how do block level elements affect the document flow?
I said these elements typically start on a new line and they create distinct blocks of content.
Yeah, exactly. So block level elements are going to take up that full row or that full section of wherever it appears on the page, which means that it's going to force any other content that comes after it to get pushed down underneath a new line. So it affects the document flow by pushing everything underneath it so that it's the only thing that appears on that block, essentially. Rukaya, how do inline elements affect the document flow?
So inline elements do not start on a new line, and they only occupy the space that's, for those elements, basically. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So inline elements, they will not start on a new line, so they'll appear next to other elements, and they'll only take up as much space as their content. So based off of whatever's inside of that element, it'll only take up as big as that content makes it. Caroline, what is the default width and height of a block level element?
So it is the actual full size of the browser. The width and the height is same. No, it's pushed up to the top of the page.
How big is my div gonna be? How big is my H1 gonna be? How tall?
Oh, depending on the default of the things that are inside of the block level.
What is the default?
Whatever that specific image or text holds.
The content, exactly. Yeah. So the default width of a block level element is the full width of the page. The default height is the height of its content. So however tall its content makes it be, that would be the default height of a block level element. Whereas in Noah, what about inline? What is the default width and height of an inline element?
Yeah, that was I was trying to get it. So it occurs within
Mhm.
the block, the block level, the block level element, so
Mhm.
it must be inside the web page.
So how much, so we said inline elements affect the document flow because they appear side by side. So what is the only space of an inline element?
So it takes, if it's the block level, takes the width of the whole
Uh-huh.
page, so the inline must be half of it,
Not half, specifically,
like a part, small part of it.
it's depending on what's inside. So the default width is the width of its content. So your inline element is only ever gonna be as wide as its content is. So in our case right here, our S tag is an inline element, right? So our S tag is only gonna have a width of however much this text is gonna take up. If I now add more numbers, well, now it's gonna be wider, right? Because there's more text content. So now the width of my, exactly. So the default width is only gonna be as wide as its content, and the same goes for its height. The height of an inline element is only gonna be as high as that content height is. Rukaya.
So for example, I wanted this, so like the S is to like strike through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say I wanted it highlighted as well. So for that, then I would use like the span element and like give it an attribute.
Yeah, so like right now, well, we have two different ways of how we could do it. We have the strike through right here, so we could also just apply our styling directly here. So then if I was writing actual CSS, I could give it a class, I could give it an ID, but we could also do inline styling. So then I could do style, and then I could do like color, you know, yellow or whatever, and it would only specifically, let's open it up. Now you can see only that specific text is yellow. So you could, since it has its own tag already, you could just apply it to the S tag in general, but you could also wrap it in a span and do that as well. No, you had a question?
And I just wanna ask you about the default width and height of the block level, so it
Mhm.
takes the whole page.
So if we inspect the page right here, so we can see our H1 is a block level element. So when I hover over it, you can see that that blue bar is taking up the full width of the page.
full width.
Even though the text ends, let me get rid of this little pop-up. Even though the text ends right there, you can see that the blue bar is still going all the way to the end of the page.
So the heights, there's a break under and there's a break above.
So there's a little peach part and then there's a blue part. The little peach part is something referred to as margin, which we'll talk about in a future exercise. But the blue part is indicating only the content. So you can see the default height of the content is only the height of its text. It's seeing how tall the text is, whereas in the default width is that full width of the page. Whereas in this is gonna change for like our inline element. Well, now when I hover over the S element, you can see that the blue little background is only over the text because the default width of an inline element is only as wide as its content. And the same with the height, it's only filling up the height of the text.
And the price,
Hmm?
sorry, but the price is the block element, right? It's part of the block level.
The P
P.
is so that P is the block level element, the S is
It's
inline.
crossing.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can give the class and ID attributes to any of the elements in HTML.
Yes, the only thing though is with IDs, they have to be unique. So if I give this an ID of 1, I cannot also give this an ID of 1. It's gonna say the value is duplicated. So IDs have to be unique. Classes can be shared though. Any an element, 10 elements can have the same class. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the styling. So we talked about block level elements, we talked about inline level elements. Where does this actually come from? Well, if you inspect the page, and if you take a look, so I'm looking at my H1 right here. If we look to the right over here, we can see all the CSS that's being applied. So these are all the styles that are getting applied from the browser. So it's built into the browser. So you can see the browser is actually applying display block for us right here. So this is what's actually making it a block level element. So every single element in HTML by default will always either be block, inline, or something else that we'll kind of talk about in a second. So block inline, and that just means that that's what's being applied to the browser by default. So you can see that the H1, it has display block, which makes our H1 and our H2 elements block level elements by default. If we looked at our S tag, for instance, though, you see there is no display property. If I look at the computed tab, there's a computed tab, and this shows you all of the values that get computed by the browser. But we can see that the display property is inline. So we can see now this is where the S is getting that inline. So if you're ever curious to see if an element is block or inline and maybe you don't fully know, you could check by just inspecting and then looking at these styles that are getting applied from the browser. It'll usually say something right here, or you could go to the computed tab and then you could check out all of the individual stuff right here, like our display inline, our height auto.
Okay, so
whatnot.
this is the margin, so you can see the text is blue and this is the padding.
So yeah, I'll show it on the H1 because that'll be better. So you can see on this H1 right here, or this H2, the text is that, and it's as wide as the text. And now you can see the margin, and that's where that peach comes into play.
So
But
the
we'll talk
blue-
about, I don't want to get into that. We'll talk more about that when we get to CSS. But specifically, this is where we can see if something's a block level element or an inline level element. We can obviously change that if we want to. So you can see right here, an element is inline. If I wanted it to be block, well, I could give it display, and then I could change it to block. And now you can see that I now made this S tag display block. Well, what happened? Well, this text underneath got pushed down, right? Because now this S element is a block level element. So what is the width? It's going to be the full width of the page. And so that's why it now pushed down that 1499 underneath it. As soon as I get rid of it, it's now an inline element again. So now you can see that it now appears side by side. One thing here. So with block level elements, let's say that I wanted to change the width and the height. So we said the default width of a block level element is the width of the web page. So we can see that that blue bar is filling up the full width of the web page. It doesn't need to be. I can change the width. So I could change the width to something like 300 pixels, for instance. Now, if I change the width to 300 pixels, well, now you can see when I hover over it, it's only taking up 300 pixels wide, and it moved all of my text to be underneath it. I can do the same thing with our height. I could set this to be 500 pixels. Well, now we can see that it added a whole lot of space beneath the other text, and now it's filling up all of that more height. So those block level elements, I can still customize the width and the height. Just by default, it's going to be the full width of the page and the height of its content, but I still can customize them. But let's take a look at our inline element. So we can see right here our S tag. Well, watch what happens if I try to give it a width. You see it's grayed out. I'll try to give it a height. It's grayed out. Hover over it, what does it say? The display inline property prevents width from having an effect. Try setting display to something other than inline. So inline elements, I cannot control the width and the height because the inline elements are only supposed to be as wide or as tall as their content. So I cannot actually change how I want this inline elements spacing to come into play. But that kind of opens up a problem. What if I want an element to be inline? I want it to appear next to other elements, but I also want control over how big that element is. So something like a button, you know, I sometimes want a button to appear side by side to other elements, but I want to control the spacing of that element. Well, that's where another display property comes into play, and it's called inline block. So by setting something to display inline block, I'm now forcing the element to be inline. So it will now still appear side by side to other elements. So we can see my S tag is still on the same line as my P tag with the text right there. But now the block portion of my inline block allows me to set the width and the height. So now we can see that the height of my S element is 400. I can decrease this And now you can see it's moving the rest of the content back on over. And the same would go for my height, if I were to get rid of my height. And now you can see my text jumped on back up, and now it's still controlling. So we have those three different display properties. We have block. Block is always going to take up the full width of the page and the height of its content. We can't change that. Inline, which is only ever going to take up as much width or height as its content. And then we have inline block, which is also an inline element, but then gives me the capability of being able to adjust its sizing with the width and the height. So it just kind of depends on what it is that you want to do. Do you have an inline element and you only care about it being as wide as its content? Just leave it as inline. Do you have an inline element, but you need a little bit more control over how big you want that element to actually be? Well, then you can use inline block. Any questions about anything I've talked about so far? Yeah. Carolyn?
I was wondering about the div and creating separate block containers.
Mm-hmm.
By using the div, we create like separate block containers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Oh,
So a div element is a block level element. So if I inspect it, we can see that the div applies display block. So sometimes like I have a collection of elements, like in this case, like I have a whole bunch of p tags, right?
mhm.
And so p tags also have display block, which gets them to already stack on top of each other by default. But maybe sometimes like I have a group of content and I want to make sure that that group of content also kind of has like a separate section, then I may wrap it in a div, because then a div creates like that new block level thing. So divs come in a lot more into play once you get into CSS, because we'll learn about Flexbox and that parent-child relationship. That's where divs come into play. Sometimes you just need a container. Like for instance, maybe I just want some sort of a container to only be containing my H1 and my H2. So then what I may do is I may wrap my H1 and my H2 in a div. And so that way I can apply styling to something that only impacts my H1 and my H2. So now maybe I wanted to make them blue. Well, now I can give the color to the div, and now it's being applied to both the H1 and the H2. So divs just come into play is just kind of like a container. I need some sort of a parent element. I need some sort of an element to hold children so that I can easily style something, so that I can easily interact with it, whatever. That's kind of where the divs would come into play. Mm-hmm. Any other initial questions? I have one other thing I want to talk about. Rukai?
So div can be a parent of the p tags, but like we can't have a div inside as like a child of the p tag, right?
You could. You definitely could. It's just it'd be a little bit unnatural that way, because p tags usually are, you're literally saying like this is a paragraph of text. So whenever you have a giant block of text, so there's nothing functionally stopping you from having divs inside of p tags. It'll work. It's just usually you're probably misusing elements in like certain places. Which kind of leads me into the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is semantic elements. So if you take a look at some of the elements we used, I used EM. I also used strong. I'm not sure if you looked it up, but there's actually a couple different ways of how you can do italicize something or bold something. So we used EM, but in theory, I could have also used I. For strong, I could have also used B for bold, but there's a difference. There's a specific reason why I use strong and a specific reason why I use EM, and that's referred to as semantic elements. So semantic elements have two main purposes. One, they are really good for SEO. So when Google indexes your web pages, it's going to scan through your HTML and it's going to count up all of the semantic elements you use. And it's like you're getting points every single time you use a semantic element. And then when it indexes them on Google, so that when I search for Sean Cost, if my website has enough of those semantic elements and like enough of those points that it makes up, that's where Google ranks what should appear on like the first page Google versus the second page of Google and whatnot. So using semantic elements, one is important for SEO because the more semantic elements we use, it means that the higher our page is going to rank on Google. And second, and the most important, is semantic elements are for accessibility purposes. So what it actually does is that it actually changes the way that the screen reader reads its content. So something like strong, when I use a strong tag, it literally changes the tone of voice of the screen reader. So now it'll say something like, enjoy complete freedom of movement. You know, it'll literally change the tone of the screen reading software's voice. So we kind of get the added benefit of also being able to convey meaning to people that have those screen reading assistant softwares, which is where something like a P tag comes into play. A P tag is a semantic element. It's going to read out that it's going to be a block of text. So it's why usually the only things you would want to put in a P tag is blocks of text, because that's semantically what a P tag stands for. Functionally, there's no reason why I can't just put anything inside of a P tag, but to make sure that our HTML is semantic and we're putting everything in the correct tags, that's why, in theory, usually P's would be children to divs rather than parents to divs themselves. So something like this, since I had multiple P elements, maybe what I could have done is I would have wrapped it in a div and maybe done something like, oh, this is going to be the description or whatever. And then I would have put all my P tags inside of the div. So this is kind of where I'm extracting away our web pages. So now I'm saying, oh, well, all of this are only going to be associated with this. Well, maybe I now have like more P tags, but these P tags are related to something else. You know, maybe this is a footer or something. And then now I have some more P tags in here. So it's just, this is where divs kind of come into play, is they allow us to kind of containerize our application, to kind of break them up into small chunks. And it's also kind of for organization purposes. We're kind of extracting things away. But div is kind of like a general element. It's not semantic. So in theory, you want to try to find other elements that are better than a div. So something like this, so what I was building is I was using a div for a footer. Well, there is actually a footer element. So it would have been better to use the footer element rather than a div. So div is just kind of like a standard, I need some sort of an element here, but I don't necessarily have a more clear of an element to use. I don't want to use a P tag because it's not text. I don't want to use an H tag because it's not a heading or something like that, but I need some sort of an element here. That's kind of where the div kind of comes into play. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of HTML elements. It's just kind of can be used as some sort of a container to hold whatever it is that we want, but it doesn't necessarily convey a meaning on its own. Any questions about that, or any other questions about anything with block and inline in general? Okay.
So similarly, if we weren't using the S tag like this for strike through, but we did want to like give it some sort of highlighting or something, then we would be using span there because we don't have anything else to use.
Yeah, so the S element specifically is for strike through. So if I didn't want the strike through and I just wanted to apply some sort of a styling, so maybe rather than striking through the element, I just wanted to change the color of that element like we did earlier with the yellow, I would still wrap it in a span. So that way I'm uniquely only targeting that specific text inside of the P. Because then if I gave the color to the P, well, then it would change all the text. And I only wanted to change that. So that's where the span would come into play. Yeah.
So what do you say? So when the span, well, what are the difference between span and?
The span is just like, so if we're going back to what we have. Span is usually used when you just kind of want to apply styling to like individual text inside of a bigger text. So something like right here, I have this P tag where it's showing the price information. I'm using a strike through right now, but let's say rather than striking through the element, I just wanted to change only the color of this specific text. Well, then what I would do is I would wrap this in a span. And then I would just only apply the styling to that span. So that way it's uniquely only around that. So now, I would give it a color or whatever. And now it's only uniquely changing that individual text color. So that's kind of where span comes into play. It's like used inside of text elements to only wrap around specific text so that you only apply styling to that specific text.
You just go back to the page, so I just want to, so this style, okay.
We'll learn more about CSS towards the end of the week in the different ways. In theory, this is a terrible way to apply our CSS. You never want to apply CSS via inline styling. We'll talk about why at the end of the week once we get to the cascade, but generally you never want to apply your styling via this way.
Is it like using div, right? Using div, right? This is the better way.
No, using a separate CSS file is a better way,
Oh,
which we'll talk about towards the end of the week.
really?
Yeah. Do you have a question?
I was just gonna ask or confirm that we could use the class, right, rather than.
Yes, so in
With
theory,
span,
like the
with
better
span.
way of how to style this is to get, I would have given the span a class, and then I would have styled that in my CSS file.
Because span is like a bigger element than P, which, so we can use the class with the span. Like we can use it with the div, but we wouldn't use a class with the P.
I would use a class on a P.
You would?
Mhm.
Oh.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I use a class on everything.
Oh,
Mhm.
thank you.
Any other questions about block versus inline? We're all good? All right, let me stop over.